Hello, my lovely viewers and listeners. Today I'm with new story for you. Let's start the story. My name's Rick, I'm 30 years old and I work at an auto parts store. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills and I've been doing it for while now. I've never really been into the whole relationship thing. After my divorce, I kind of just focused on work and stayed out of the dating scene. Not that it bothered me much. I've always been the kind of guy who's fine being on his own. It was about 6 months ago when I first met Brad. He was a new guy at work, just starting as an intern. I remember when he first walked into the shop, he seemed a little out of place, but he had this energy about him, like he was eager to prove himself. I've been around long enough to spot those who were just here for the paycheck and those who actually care. Brad seemed like the latter. We hit it off right away, mostly because he showed him the ropes and helped him get settled into the job over time. We started talking. More nothing major, just casual work stuff, some banter here and there. He was younger than me, but there was something about him that made him easy to get along with. One day after a long shift, Brad asked if I could give him a ride home. He didn't have a car yet and the bus routes weren't the best. Didn't mind. I figured it would be a quick drive and a chance to chat more. Little did I know that ride would end up being the start of something I didn't expect. As we were driving, Brad mentioned that his mom Regina was making dinner that night and invited me to join them. I thought it was a bit unusual, like I hardly knew the guy that well, but insisted and said she wouldn't mind. Honestly, I was curious. I hadn't really hung out with anyone outside of work in a while, and it seemed like a nice change of pace, so I agreed. We pulled up to a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood. Brad led me inside, and immediately I was hit with the smell of something delicious. Regina greeted us with a warm smile, and I could tell right away she was one of those people who just exude kindness. She was around 40, but she had this energy about her that made her look younger, and she didn't seem like the kind of person who would someone based on first impressions. We sat down to dinner and the conversation flowed easily. Regina was a good listener and we ended up talking about everything, from work to life in general. It was clear that she had a strong sense of self, but she wasn't one of those people who seemed too perfect or put together. She was relaxed, easygoing, and I felt comfortable around her immediately. It wasn't like I was attracted to her right away. I mean, she was older than me, and that was something I'd never really thought about before but there was something about her that drew me in. Maybe it was her maturity or the way she spoke with such ease and confidence, or how she seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. I don't know, it felt nice to be around someone who actually listened. After dinner, we sat around the living room for a while just chatting. And then Brad mentioned that he had an early morning and was heading to bed. I figured it was time for me to leave, but Regina offered me a drink and I didn't feel rushed to go just yet. We continued talking. For a bit longer that night, I walked away from her house with a strange feeling. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a sense that something had shifted, even if I didn't know exactly what it was. It wasn't just the dinner or the conversation. There was a connection there. I couldn't deny it, but what surprised me the most was that I didn't feel uncomfortable about it. In fact, I found myself thinking about Regina more than I expected. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure: I was definitely going to think twice the next time I was invited over. So after that night, I didn't really think much of it at first. I was back to my usual routine, working at the shop, hanging out with Brad occasionally after hours. But the thing was, I couldn't stop thinking about Regina, not in some obsessive way, but more like she'd left a lasting impression on me. It wasn't just the way she looked, although I won't lie, she was attractive for her age. It was her presence, her personality. I hadn't met many people like her. She was so grounded. She had this ability to make you feel like everything you said mattered. I never met a woman who made me feel that comfortable in my own skin, especially someone older. There was no pressure, no expectations. It was just easy. I tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing on work and stuff, but it wasn't long before Brad invited me over again. This time, hesked me in passing while we were on break at the shop. "Hey Rick," he said, "Mom's making lasagna tonight. You should come by." I hesitated. For a second. Lasagna? You sure she's okay with me tagging along again? Brad just shrugged. She likes shaving people over. She's pretty chill. I wasn't exactly sure why, but I agreed. Maybe it was the thought of a home-cooked meal, or maybe it was just because Regina had made such an impression on me that night. Either way, I didn't have much going on, So why not that evening I drove over to their house. Again, when I walked in, Regina greeted me with the same warn as before. It was like she hadn't skipped a beat. Her smile felt genuine, and I realized I wasn't as nervous as I thought I'd be. She led me to the dining table where the lasagna looked incredible, just the way I liked it, with extra cheese. We sat down and started eating, chatting casually. The conversation was easy. Regina talked about her job, how she'd been at the same company for years, and how she never really felt the need to remarry after her divorce. She didn't go into much detail about her ex, but from what I could gather, she'd been through her share of challenges and had learned to focus on herself. And her son Brad, on the other hand, seemed more quiet tonight. He was still there, but he was preoccupied with his phone, probably texting his friends. I couldn't blame him. He was young, still figuring out life, and I was sure hanging out with his mom and me wasn't at the top of his priority list. But Regina didn't seem to mind. She didn't rush him, didn't make him feel guilty for not being fully engaged, aged. She just accepted him as he was, and that was something I found kind of admirable. After dinner, we all moved into the living room to relax. Brad eventually excused himself to head upstairs, leaving me alone with Regina. It was a little awkward at first. I'd been over a few times now, but there was still this tension that I couldn't quite shake. I wasn't sure if it was just the fact that I'd never spent time alone with her like this before, or if it was something more. We sat down on the couch and Regina asked me about work, how things were going, how I liked the job. I told her it wasn't anything special, but I was getting by. She nodded, seeming to really listen to what I had to say. Then she did something I wasn't expecting. She reached over, placed her hand on mine, and said, "You know, Rick, I really appreciate you coming over. It's nice having someone to talk to." It was such a simple gesture, but it felt meaningful. I didn't know why it struck me the way it did, but for a moment I felt this wave of warmth. There was something in her eyes, something that made me think maybe, just maybe, she was feeling what I was feeling too. I pulled my hand away slightly, not out of discomfort, but because I wasn't sure if it was just me misreading the situation. Was she just being kind, or was there something more behind it? "I'm glad to be here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I enjoy talking with you," she smiled, and for a moment it felt like time slowed down. There was this unspoken understanding between us, a quiet connection that I couldn't deny. We talked for a little while longer. Just small talk, but it felt different. This time, more personal by the time I left. That evening I wasn't sure what to make of everything. My mind was racing. There was a part of me that wanted to keep this connection with Regina going. But at the same time I knew I had to be careful. She was Brad's mom, and that could complicate things. But as I drove home, one thing was clear. I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, and I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next few days felt different. It was subtle. At first almost imperceptible, but I could feel it. There was a shift in how I looked at Regina, and in how she looked at me. It was like we had crossed some invisible line without even realizing it. Every time I saw her, my heart would race a little faster. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I couldn't deny the chemistry that was starting to grow. Between us, I kept telling myself to take a step back. After all, Regina was Brad's mom, and I'd only known her for a few weeks, but there was something in the way she looked at me, something in the way her touch lingered for just a second, longer than it should have. I couldn't ignore it. One evening after another, typical day at the auto parts store, Brad texted me again. He invited me over for dinner. I'd already been to their place twice in the past week, but for some reason this time felt different. I didn't hesitate. I said yes without even thinking. I showed up at their house, and as usual, Regina greeted me with that warm smile of hers. But this time, there was something else in her eyes, something more than just friendliness. I wasn't imagining it. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, longer than necessary, and there was this softness in her expression that I hadn't noticed before. "Hi, Rick," she said, her voice calm but with a certain warmth to it. "I'm glad you came over. I made your favorite tonight, lasagna. I hope you're hungry." I smiled, trying to keep things casual. "You remember? I like lasagna." She lobbed a soft, melodic laugh that seemed to fill the room. "Of course I do. I'm a good listener." Remember, we sat down at the table and I couldn't help but notice how easy it was to talk to her. The conversation flowed naturally, just like before, but this time there was an added layer. We talked about everything: work-life, relationships, but the way we spoke to each other felt different, more intimate, more personal after dinner. We moved to the living room and I could tell Brad was ready to head upstairs. He gave me a quick wave and excused himself, disappearing for the night. I almost expected it. I knew he was a teenager and probably had better things to do than hang out with his mom and her friend, but it left me alone with Regina once again. We sat on the couch, the room quiet, except for the soft hum of the TV in the background for a moment. Neither of us said anything, we just looked at each other and I could feel the air between us charged with something unspoken. Finally, Regina broke the silence. "Rick, you've been meaning to tell you something," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I'm really glad you've been coming over. I've enjoyed our time together more than I thought I would." Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. My chest tightened and I realized I had been holding my breath. She was saying what I had been feeling all along. This wasn't just a friendship anymore. There was something more, something deeper. I opened my mouth to respond, but I didn't know what to say. My thoughts were a mess. I was both relieved and terrified. What did this mean? Where would it go? Could I really let myself feel something for her before I could say anything? Regina reached over and gently touched my hand. Her fingers brushed against mine, and I felt a spark run through me. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It felt like she was waiting for me to take the next step. "I know this might seem strange," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know, I just feel something when I'm around you, and I think you feel it too, don't you?" I swallowed hard. I couldn't lie. I did feel it. I felt it every time I saw her, every time we spoke, but I was scared to acknowledge it. I didn't want to make things complicated, but sitting there, looking into her eyes, I knew that something real was starting to grow between us. Regina smiled softly, and in that moment it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. She wasn't just a friend of Brad's mom anymore. She wasn't just some woman I admired from a distance. She was someone I could see myself with, and she felt the same way. She squeezed my hand gently. "I'm glad you feel that way. I wasn't sure if I was just imagining things, but now I know I'm not alone in this." Her words gave me a sense of reassurance, but I still wasn't sure where we were headed. The age gap, the fact that she was Brad's mom. It all seemed like so much to overcome, but in that moment, with her hand in mine, all I could think about was how right it felt to be close to her. "I'm not sure what happens next," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "But I'd like to find out with you," Regina nodded, her smile widening. "We'll figure it out together, Rick, one step at a time." And with that, I knew this was just the beginning of something new, something real. And no matter what happened, I wasn't going to walk away from it. Not now, when I finally felt like I'd found something worth holding on to. I finally said, my voice a little shakier than I intended. "I feel it too." The days after that night felt different. There was this quiet understanding between Regina and me that neither of us fully acknowledged, but both could feel. We saw each other regularly, the conversations more meaningful. The silences less awkward. We weren't just two people trying to figure each other out anymore. We were starting to become something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but at the same time something I couldn't ignore. I kept replaying that moment when she touched my hand, when she said she felt the same way I did. My heart still raised when I thought about it, and yet the weight of the situation started to settle in. This wasn't just a passing crush. There were real feelings involved, and I wasn't sure how to handle them. Regina was Brad's mom. She was 10 years older than me, and there were so many reasons why this shouldn't be happening. I didn't want to complicate things, not with her, not with Brad. But every time I saw her, I couldn't deny what was growing between us. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed to approach this the right way. I couldn't just let things continue without fully understanding what I wanted and what I was willing to risk. We needed a real conversation. We needed to take a step forward, and I needed to take charge of the situation. One evening, I decided to act. I had been thinking about it for a while, and it was time I needed to ask Regina out on a proper date. Not just another casual dinner or hangout. I wanted to take her to a place that felt special, a place where we could both be ourselves without any distractions, somewhere quiet, somewhere comfortable, somewhere that felt like our space away from the expectations of the world around us. I texted Regina that evening, asking if she'd like to meet me at a cozy little Italian restaurant. I knew it was small, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, and it had a charm that made it feel intimate without being overwhelming, the kind of place where you could have a real conversation, where the world outside seemed to fade away. I wasn't sure what her response would be. Was she ready for this? Had I rushed things? But when she replied with a simple, "I'd love to," my heart skipped a beat. There was something in her words that made me feel like I wasn't the only one who had been thinking about taking this step. She was just as ready as I was. The night of our date arrived, and I felt an unfamiliar mixture of nerves and excitement. I wanted everything to be perfect, but more than anything, I wanted Regina to know that I was serious about her. This wasn't just some passing flirtation or casual attraction. I had thought long and hard about this moment, and I was ready to face whatever came next. I arrived at the restaurant early, wanting to be there before she arrived. I needed a few minutes to calm my nerves. The restaurant was just as I remembered, dimly lit with soft jazz music playing in the background. It was the perfect atmosphere for a quiet evening of conversation. When Regina walked through the door, looking effortlessly beautiful in a simple but elegant dress, I felt my heart stow for a moment. She was stunning, and the way she smiled when she saw me made everything feel right. I stood up to greet her, and as she reached me, I couldn't help but take a moment to just breathe her in, the familiarity of her presence, the way she made everything else feel insignificant. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. "Wow, Rick," she said softly, her eyes twinkling as she took in the setting. "This place is beautiful." I smiled, leading her to our table. "I'm glad you like it. Thought it would be the perfect place for us to talk, to get to know each other better." She nodded, her gaze meeting mine with a warmth that I couldn't quite describe. "I'm glad you're taking this seriously, Rick. I've been thinking about it too, you know." My heart skipped a beat. "I've been thinking about it a lot, actually," I admitted. "I don't want to rush things, but I also don't want to pretend like nothing's happening between us. This feels real, and I want to know if it feels that way for you too." She smiled gently, her fingers brushing against Minnie as she reached for a glass of wine. "It does, it really does, and that scares me a little if I'm being honest, but I also can't deny that it feels right. Being with you feels right." The sincerity in her voice made everything else fade away in that moment. I wasn't worried about the age difference or Brad or anything else that had been nagging at me. All that mattered was that she was here sitting across from me, sharing the same feelings, and that was enough. We spent the rest of the evening talking about our lives, our dreams, and the things that made us who we were. It wasn't just about building a connection, it was about learning who each other was, what made us tick, and what we wanted from this relationship. As the night came to a close, I walked Regina to her car, my heart racing with anticipation. I knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy. But as we stood there, the quiet hum of the city in the background, I felt more sure of myself than I had in a long time. "I'm glad we did this," Gina said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm glad we're doing this," I smiled, taking a deep breath. "So am I, Regina. So am I." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. Whatever came next, I knew I wasn't facing it alone. The following week was a whirlwind. Things between Regina and I were progressing slowly, but surely. We had shared more dinners, more moments of quiet understanding, but still, there was a certain hesitation in there. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, but I knew, deep down, that it had something to do with Brad. He was, after all, the one person who could either make or break this situation. I couldn't help but feel a little nervous about how he would take it when he found out about me and his mom. We hadn't talked much about Regina and me, but I could tell he was. Noticing the small shifts in our interactions, it was clear that something was different. Something was changing between us. and I had a feeling Brad might have already suspected it one afternoon after our shift at the auto shop. Brad and I were talking in the break room. It was one of those rare moments when the store wasn't swamped, and we could actually talk without being interrupted by customers or the buzz of engines. "Hey man." Brad started tossing his work, gloves onto the counter. "You and my mom. You guys seem to be getting along pretty well lately." I paused, unsure of how to respond at first. There was no denying that things had shifted between me and Regina. But now that Brad had brought it up, I couldn't avoid it any longer. "Yeah, we've been spending more time together," I said carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. "She's great, Brad. She's easy to talk to." Brad leaned against the counter, a playful smile on his face. "Yeah, I can tell. She talks about you a lot at home, man. Says you've been a big help teaching me the ropes at the shop." I couldn't help but smile at that. Well, she's a good listener, and she's one of the few people who really seems to get the work. I do. Brad's smile faded slightly, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost like he was proud. She's always had a thing for taking care of people. She's like that with me too, always making sure I'm doing okay, checking in with me, giving me advice. I know it sounds weird, but I think that's why I like it when she talks about you. She's been a little lonely for a while. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Regina had been on her own for so long after her divorce, and I could only imagine how difficult it must have been for her raising Brad and trying to keep things together by herself. "She's a great woman, Brad," I said. "Sincerely, you're lucky to have her in your corner." Brad chuckled a little, embarrassed. "Yeah, I know she's the best, but sometimes I wish she could find someone to, be with. She's been alone for as long as I can remember. I don't think she's ever really given herself the chance to be happy with someone else. I looked at Bert, trying to process what he was saying. It was clear that he cared deeply for his mom, and I respected that. But there was also something in his words that hinted at his own desire for her to have more, to find that connection again. "I get it," I said slowly, "but I don't think it's easy for her to just jump into anything. She's been on her own for a long time, and she deserves someone who understands that." Brad nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, she's always been there for me, but sometimes I feel like she's not doing enough for herself. She deserves to be treated the way she treats others. And honestly, Rick, you're one of the few people I've seen her open up to like this in a long time. That caught me off guard, really." Brad looked at me seriously, his voice quieter now. "Yeah, you make her happy, man, and I can see that she's really into you. It's kind of weird, my mom dating, but I guess it's time. She deserves it." I hadn't expected Brad to be so open about it, but hearing him speak with such understanding and maturity made me realize how important it was for me to handle this situation with care. "I'm glad you feel that way, Brad," I said, my voice steady. "I really am. And I care about your mom more than I expected to. I don't want to hurt her, and I don't want things to be awkward between us. I think we just need to take things slow, figure it out, and see where it goes." Brad smiled, giving me a pat on the back. "I know, I could tell. You're a good guy, and honestly, if she's happy, that's all that matters to me." Wes stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. I realized then that Brad wasn't just accepting of what was happening between Regina and me, he was encouraging it. It made me feel a little better, a little more sure of what I was doing. Regina and I weren't just two people getting to know each other. We were building something real, something that might actually work. "I'm glad we talked about this, Brad," I said. "It means a lot to me." "Yeah, me too," he replied. "Just don't mess this up, all right?" I chuckled, relieved by his easygoing tone. "I won't, man, I promise." And with that, I felt a little more confident in what lay ahead. Regina and I had something real, and now with Brad's blessing, I felt like we could move forward, whatever that looked like. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but it didn't seem so daunting anymore. His words made me feel both proud and uneasy. At the same time, the days since that conversation with Brad had been filled with quiet anticipation. Things between Regina and me felt different now, in the best way possible. We weren't rushing into anything, but there was a clear understanding between us. It was like we'd both realized that we wanted to be together, and that was enough for now. We'd spent more evenings together talking, laughing, and just enjoying each other's company. Regina was the kind of person who made every feel easier. She was patient, thoughtful, and had a way of making the world feel like it was slowing down when I was with her. The little things we shared, cooking dinner together, talking about our past, learning more about each other every day, felt special, even though they seemed. Simple. Brad, too, had been an important part of this new chapter. At first, I wasn't sure how he would take our growing connection, but after our conversation, I could see that he genuinely wanted his mom to be happy, and more than that, he wanted me to be a part of that happiness. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders knowing that he supported us. It made everything easier. One evening after work, Regina and I decided to take a walk around the park. Near her house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows on the ground, and the air was crisp. It felt like the perfect moment to talk about where we were, what we wanted, and what we saw for the future. As we walked side by side, I couldn't help but smile. I was genuinely happy. It wasn't the kind of happiness that came from the excitement of something new. It was the kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be. Rick, Regina said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. I've been thinking a lot lately about us, about what this is. I glanced over. Heather, my heart skipping a beat. Me too. I say it, I think we're both in the same place. She smiled, her eyes soft and warm. I know, even taking it slow, and I like that. But I also know that I don't want to wait forever to see where this goes. He stopped walking, turning to face her. Regina, are you saying? She reached out, placing her hand gently on my arm. I'm saying that I want to be with you, Rick. I don't want to keep pretending like we're just friends. I care about you, and I think we both know it. I felt a rush of emotion. There was something so reassuring in her words, something so simple yet so deeply real. This was what I had been waiting for. It wasn't about rushing things. It was about the clarity that came from being honest with ourselves. I want that too. Regina, I said, my voice steady but full of feeling. I care about you so much, and I'm not going anywhere. She smiled, her eyes glistening with something I couldn't quite name. It was hope, I realized. Hope for the future. Hope for what was coming next. And it made me feel like I was exactly where I needed to be. I'm glad, Em, she said softly, because I've spent so much time alone, Rick. So many years thinking that I didn't deserve to be happy. But you've shown me that I do that. I can have something real. And I want that. With you, her words hit me harder than I expected. It made me realize how much she had been through, how much she had given up to take care of Brad, to build a life for herself after her divorce. And yet here, she was standing in front of me, willing to open her heart again. I'm here, Regina, I said quietly. I want to build something with you, something real. She nodded, and there was a peace in her expression that made me feel like we had made the right choice. Later that evening, we sat down at our kitchen table, the same one where we had shared countless meals and conversations. It felt like the perfect place to solidify what we had both been, feeling we were ready to take that next step to make it official. So, what now? I asked, looking at her with a mixture of excitement and a little uncertainty. Are we? Regina laughed softly, her gaze steady. We're in this together, Rick. I think we've both known that for a while now. Let's just take it one day at a time. But yes, we're officially a couple now. And with that, everything fell into place. The weight I had been carrying, whether this was the right thing, whether we were rushing it, disappeared. I realized that sometimes the right thing wasn't the thing that came with a clear, detailed plan. Sometimes it was just two people coming together because they had found something special. The next day I stopped by Brad's house. I knew I had to tell him what had happened. He had been a big part of this journey, and I wanted him to know how things were progressing between Regina and me. Brad was sitting on the couch, his usual grin on his face as I walked in. "So how's it going?" he asked, casually, though I could tell he was eager to know the answer. I took a deep breath and smiled. "It's going really well, man. Regina and we decided to be together. Officially." Brad's eyes lit up with a genuine smile. "That's awesome. Rick, I'm happy for you guys. She deserves to be happy." I can see it in her eyes. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Brad wasn't just okay with it, he was happy. For us, and that was everything. "Thanks, Brad," I said, clapping him on the back. "I appreciate it. We're just taking things slow, but I think we're both excited for what's ahead." Brad gave me a thumb up. "Good luck, man. She's a great woman, I know. You'll make her happy." And with that, I knew that this was it. This was the beginning of something real. Regina and I had found each other at just the right time, and with Brad's blessing, I felt like we could face anything that came our way. As I left the house, I looked over at Regina, who was waiting for me in the driveway. We were both a little nervous, but we were ready to see where this journey would take us together.